maybe everybody who, I see, Zach, are you in the group? Are you in our group? Are you with us, or are you against us? No, I just want to make sure we know who's in the group. Are you in the group, Miss? No? Okay. So maybe we want to introduce ourselves then, those who are in the group. Erkenbeck, do you want to come up to the front row? And please, I know it's a little bit difficult to make this interactive with this huge stage, but yeah. You? That was my suggestion. Yeah, I mean, Dork will be taking notes. So we wanted to focus this discussion on the issue of early warning and early response. Niels Scott, who is our RC for Georgia and resident representative of UNDP in Georgia, and a veteran of OCHA humanitarian aid and conflict response, is going to talk a little bit about why early warning and early response is important when it comes to identifying and managing risks around social cohesion and conflict, the risks we were discussing yesterday in the panel. Parviz, will you join us, please? Thanks so much. So I'm going to hand it over to Niels to speak a little bit about his experience and insights, and then we are going to have a discussion amongst yourselves. We're going to group you, cluster you, from different perspectives around early warning and early response to conflict drivers, and then we'll come back in plenary and conclude. So, Niels.
Good morning. I don't know what the veteran part was about, but I have had a little humanitarian experience. Look, I'm not going to be able to dig very deeply into the whole world of early warning and early response, early action in the amount of time. The main thing is to have a discussion. But maybe just to warm the crowd up, I'll make some comments. The basic premise, sort of grosso modo, early warning, early action is good. You know, we all like to be warned early. It's better than being warned after the event. And early action or any type of action is great. Nobody's arguing with that. You know, we all like it. It's a good thing. But what exactly is it we're speaking about when we speak about early warning, early action? And I'll try and put this in the context of conflict, since this is what this particular discussion is leading to. Basically, early warning it's a system. It's meant to be a system. It's meant to be a fluent series of tools which all contribute to some form of forecasting and prediction. So it's hazard mapping, it's monitoring. We could add to the list its disaster risk assessment, communication, preparedness, systems and processes, and hopefully early warning isn't just an art form in itself. It's also related to other ongoing related process, research, science, certainly aspects of gender and so on, should be closely connected. Early warning goes from the very simple. I always think of swallows flying low before a storm. Actually, apparently there's a reason for this. Before a storm, the air thickens and insects apparently get nearer to the water, which means that the swallows go down. But that's actually one form of early warning which works quite well. Not much use for conflict, admittedly, but it's an example. It goes from the simple to the enormously complicated early warning systems. But the importance of early warning has been outlined, and in the Sendai framework, it's been defined as early warning has been defined as one of the 7 global targets, which, to quote, is to substantially increase the availability of an access to multi-hazard early warning systems. So there it is in black and white in the Sendai framework. There's a variety of conflict early warning systems on the qualitative side, which typically draw on local area expertise, individuals or groups or communities with extensive knowledge of a country or region. The International Crisis Group would be an example of a qualitative early warning system. On the quantitative side, there are a number of methodologies. They tend to take conflict trends and use mathematical techniques, which certainly evade me, to forecast future trends. And one example would be the Integrated Conflict Early Warning System, which some of you may have come across, which appears to have some effect. And then there's combinations of qualitative and quantitative early warning systems like Swiss pieces. I don't know if it still exists, but they used to have something called FAST, which was a project they launched. And then many organizations have early warning systems. I mean, UNDP, for example, have the, get it right, the Crisis Risk Dashboard, which is another approach. So they exist. Some methodologies work well. Some perhaps work a little less well. And let's not forget, I mean, the whole case for, the whole idea of an early warning system was very much brought out by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, where quite clearly there was a deficit of early warning. And there have been challenges going forward. The 2008 conflict in Georgia, could that have been predictable? Could it have been preventable? Possibly both, but in the end, neither was particularly well achieved. And I'm also mindful, and this is something that always occurs to me in thinking about conflict and early warning. The 2008, the 20th OSCE Ministerial Conference, which I think was from the 6th to the 8th of December 2013, took place in Kiev at a time when protests had already started. What became Euromaidan had started. 6th to the 8th of December. By the 20th of February, that's 2 months later, within 48 hours, tragically 88 people were killed by snipers in the assembly in Maidan. The 22nd, try to get it right, Yankovic had fled the country. By the 27th, government buildings in Crimea had been taken over by pro-Russian militia, if you want to use that term. Could that have been predicted? It's not there were 60 foreign ministers and high-level members of delegations in Kiev in December, and yet we didn't seem to know that Ukraine crisis, many people said the Ukraine crisis came as a surprise to us, and these 60 people were probably among the best informed and the most sensitive to evolutions in the CIS in the region, and yet we weren't able to predict it. So I suppose there is a question of methodology, there is a question of ability, but there's a capacity, but there's also, I guess, a question of what the strategic intent is for early warning, early action. And maybe to express this a bit more clearly, can we use a traffic light? It's an awful analogy, but we'll try. The traffic light seen in terms of a hazard scanning exercise, traffic lights, it may not be generally known to people, certainly in Georgia, I'm not sure it's universally known that the sequence is green, yellow, red, for anybody who's driven in that country. It's questionable, but in early warning terms, green could be seen as acceptable risk. Slovenia, for the sake of suggesting a country. Yellow could be increasing unacceptable risk. I shouldn't have started. Now I'm going to have to think of a country for yellow and red. Armenia. it's temporary, one would guess, but I guess that Armenia might be yellow at the moment. And then red, where action is required. That might be Ukraine, for example, quite clearly. But what I would put to you, I think this sort of opens a discussion to some extent. What I would put to you is that perhaps the tendency so far has been to concentrate on the yellow to red phase, the bit where the unacceptable risk suddenly spills over and turns into conflict. And indeed, in the word early warning, it's somehow, you get this impression of this is it. This is the last stage in the development, in the escalation of risk, and somehow a feeling of a final phase. But the emphasis has quite a lot of it has been on response rather than on prevention. And the other way of looking at early warning would be to focus on the green to yellow phase of the traffic light, from the acceptable increasing to the unacceptable risk. So that rather than responding or trying to manage a conflict, the focus would be on trying to reduce risk or indeed on preventing conflict. And the United Nations Secretary General has been very clear on this. For decades, he says, our approach to peace and security has been dominated by responding to conflict. For the future, we need to do far more to prevent war and to sustain peace. So this is obviously not so straightforward. I'm sure most people in the room would agree with the thinking behind it, but would perhaps say, well, how do we do it? We can't just unscrew the red bulbs in the traffic lights and say, there won't be conflict. There will be conflict. There'll be further resources dedicated to conflict, which could be used for prevention but have to be used for response. And if you look at EU humanitarian funding this past 12 months, and here I'm slightly guessing, but I think I'm probably about right, 70% of EU humanitarian funding has gone on refugees and IDPs. In other words, the consequences of conflict and not the prevention. And it doesn't, of course, help when you have a World Humanitarian Summit whose aim, amongst others, is finding ways to prevent and end conflicts. It takes place without the leaders of any of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. That doesn't doesn't contribute to the effort. But despite these challenges, the way ahead seems very clear. It seems evident to focus increasingly on identifying the drivers of conflict and further developing our abilities and our skills in conflict prevention. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Niels. I'm going to ask colleagues who want to participate in the discussion. The discussion is actually going to be up here in the first couple of rows. So please, I see colleagues that I know can add value. Olaf, Bob, Tomislav, Runa. I see you out there. Come on up, because I know you have interesting things to say. Please do, if you want to be a part of the discussion, please come and sit up front, because the discussion is now going to take place in this space. But Niels has just framed the discussion that we want to have. Shifting early warning and early response from the yellow to red, from the response. Marta, I mean literally these two, yeah. Shifting one up doesn't work, but we need to come all the way up. Sorry. So shifting the response from, or our view of early warning from the yellow to red stage, from there to the green to yellow stage, shifting from, or adding on to what are known early warning systems with respect to, or more known, and more, I think, sophisticated early warning systems with respect to disaster, to how do we develop systems in communities with respect to more intangible, conflict-related, social cohesion-related risks. So what we're going to ask you guys to do as a group is actually separate into 3 smaller groups, and we'll just cluster you and ask you to take the perspective, each group to take the perspective of one major stakeholder at the national level for the purposes of this exercise, or local level, not at the multinational level. Either the UN or an international organization, one group, another group, national authorities, government authorities or local authorities, and the third group, civil society, community activists. And to discuss from that perspective, what are the main sort of mechanisms and indicators and approaches to early warning that make sense, and who should be the players. And then we're going to come back together in a full group, and from each of the perspectives, see what the early warning systems that you came out of, working from your perspective, and try and merge them into a set of recommendations of how early warning and early action could look at a national level. And the reason to do this is to both allow you to discuss and also to recognize that while anybody can objectively say this would be the ideal system, once you put it in a national context, in a political economy, in a dynamic, of course, different groups have different perspectives and views on these things. So there's no point in talking in abstract. We want you to sort of take on a role and a perspective of a certain group within a society that would have an agenda or a view on early warning. Is this making sense? Group of passive listeners are now going to become a group of active, engaged participants. Yes? Okay, so I will ask Bob, Sanika, oh, we lost Zach. Okay, Bob, Sanika, Zach, oh my gosh, then it's all of the Belarus country office. I'll ask Bob, Sanika, Mara, I'm sorry, your name? Michael, and Gobahor to be one group. Sanika, what do you want to be? National authority, UN, or civil society? National authority group. Excellent. I'll ask Yagoda, Mara, Sonia, Erkenbeck, Marta, to be another group. Should you be civil society? Because Sonia is everything that civil society should be. Excellent. Leila, you're in that group, yeah? Did I say you? You're sort of sitting in that group, so why don't you stay? And then we'll ask Rune, Parvis, colleague. Sorry? Matteo, Ivan. Erkenbeck, are you in civil society? So you're a smaller group. I don't know, maybe Niels, you could join them. You guys would then be the UN. Or Ivan, do you want to be in national authority since you are a national authority? Okay, you would join these colleagues over here. Yeah, why don't you be in the UN? Ask you to role play something else. Exactly. Okay, excellent. So you guys are the United Nations or the international community, Niels? This group? Sorry, Bob? Last chance for those sitting in the audience. Yeah. To join this, you will no longer be passive listener. You will now be active participant. Tomislav, please come join us. Yeah? Join this group, the international community group. Runa. Michael. Sonia. So the national government is, of course, the first to the table, right on time, only has 15 minutes, so we need to get going. Civil society is still talking.
As they should.
As they should.
Civil society should be talking.
The UN is fragmented and siloed. Nobody's talking to each other. They're only...
What else is new?
Yes. The problem is I can't pronounce Runa's name because it's... Where are you from?
From Germany.
Okay. It's Runa. Çok teşekkürler. Sonia. So a good UN bureaucrat, please. Niels was taking notes? No, those were the questions. I don't know if anybody followed. Sonia, Niels. Because you're going to have to conclude for the group. Okay. So now we're going to hear the perspectives of each of the groups as articulated from the representative of the group. And then maybe I encourage you, if we can, I know it's a little difficult to get out of this presentation mode, but perhaps have a little bit of an interactive discussion amongst the three groups about what your conclusions were. As I said, the UN, I heard it was just all too complicated and difficult to solve. Civil society has many, many ideas. And national governments, we weren't sure. They were talking about legislation last time I went in to the group. So let's see what we have. Who would like to start? Maybe we start with the government?
Yes, thank you. Well, we had, of course, given time constraints, an aphoristic and short discussion on it, but basically we kind of came up with the logic that what kind of mechanisms a national government would need in order to detect crises or early warning of crises in its sort of country would depend first of all on what kind of government it is. Is it an inclusive democratic government or is it a more authoritarian government? So we kind of came up with two ideal types, whereas I'm sure in most countries there are mixes of elements. And we had one of our colleagues giving the excellent example of an authoritarian government. In this case, that was the old Myanmar, where you basically had a cascade of people being responsible from, for security and informing upwards from possible conflicts that would erupt at a lower level. Into such a detail that at the end of this chain, of this cascade, you had one person being responsible to spy on or tell about or also upwardly discuss the needs of 10 households. So that was the level of, let's say, a control you had over the country, which is quite detailed, of course, and would give higher up if the system works well, quite some social control, so that somebody would say in this small village in I don't know, in the southeast where we never hear anything about, there are 5 households or there are 50 households which are really angry about the latest electricity price rises and they want to do something. So this is kind of the authoritarian type of early warning through very tight control. Then on the other side, we said, okay, and we ran out of time, I think, to discuss the complexities of how you do this in sort of the other ideal type, an inclusive democratic country and government. But, I mean, one thing that was quite clear was that we needed free media for that in order to have good information as a government of the problems in different parts of the country. So free and unimpeded media and freedom of expression so that people could voice their concerns if something happens. And then as a government, oh, right, in this area people are not happy with something which we've done. And as a sort of classic example, not classic, but as a recent example, sorry, we discussed the Romania case and the protests that have had erupted over the last a couple of months there after this anti-corruption law was supposed to be passed, and the huge mobilization that people had in Romania, which forced the government finally to give up on this very contentious piece of legislation. So this is pretty much where we stood. I think that summarizes the discussion in our group, I think, to an extent. And my time is up.
All our time is up. Great. So either very, very specific authoritarian control or mass protests. Those are our options from the national government side. Shall we go? Sorry? But peaceful protests, yes, of course, because otherwise we would be.
Shelley, we have a couple of headlines. Obviously, conflict occurs when people.
No, I was just kidding.
The bottom line is, we got to have this. Making sure that we're in the potential hotbeds, universities, churches, mosques, temples, the UN.
Fantastic. Yes, exactly. Okay, so now let's move to the UN maybe before we go to civil society. Do you want to be first?
Yes, so Shelley pushed us into action because we were, as the UN, discussing and analyzing a lot and not really getting up with something concrete. But I think that little provocation helped us quite a lot to start moving in a more specific and conclusive direction. And I think towards the end, we kind of looked at the need for having an early warning system that should be somewhat objective and independent. We know that there's many tools that already exist, and some of these might be very useful in trying to understand when things are getting more and more difficult or complicated. And then, of course, we also realized at that point, if there's a trigger point, that these tools can be manipulated, especially by political forces that wouldn't like to be seen as, having a situation of conflict. So we thought that maybe one thing that could be done there is to try to have, as we move along, maybe in like an index or sliding scale of more and more intensive conflict situation, that we would invite a more objective and broad stakeholder analysis of the situation that would help us give more credibility to what we're seeing in an index or a tool that would describe the conflict situation, and from a UNCT or a UN point of view, that would trigger certain kind of warning signs, possibility of alerting and upwards in the system or to partners in the country, and also stand on the ground that it's not only about what the UN is seeing, it's actually a broad analysis that would give some kind of warning of something is happening and we need to do something about it. Of course, then all kinds of complications comes in. What happens with this information? Now we see we need to do something. So who should do this? I mean, who springs into action? Is it, what do we do about a Security Council if it's a very big conflict that has some geopolitical connotations? Who else is the actors that we need to mobilize? The government, civil society at different levels, other UN organizations, other organizations broadly. And how do we, going from saying, yes, we see there's some risk factors, some alarm bells that's going on, how do we then move from there to some specific action that would be helpful, and hopefully before it gets too complicated.
So great, Runa. I mean, I think Matteo said take Bosnia-Herzegovina, where everybody knows the risks, but there's such entrenchment. How do you get action? And I think the action side of it, we don't do early warning for the sake of early warning. We do early warning to enable us to do something to prevent. So the UN and other entities, analytical players, everybody can sort of see the security risks and can talk about them and analyze them. But we really fall down often when we don't know exactly and nobody's quite sure who should do what and how to address them. Or there's a stasis and there's fear within those who have a lot of say or influence that if they do something radical, it could make it even worse. Or if they do act in a different way than the status quo, there might be unintended consequences. So, great. Now, civil society.
We were mostly discussing the situations we knew in the past, just to have an analogy to understand what the task of the exercise was. And what we realized is first that the conflict, the war is decided on the top, in the government, not in the, is prepared there. But it is decided by the majority of the people who accept to solve the problem with the war. How it becomes normal to go into the war. Because in the stage when this was preparing, the voices of those who have a different solution and are asking for peaceful solution, for dialogue, for peaceful ways out of something which is a real problem, are not heard. So in the civil society, what is important to do is, first of all, to strengthen our analytical possibilities in the sense to analyze the situation, what is the danger, and also to propose an alternative solution to the war. It's not enough to say we are for peace, but how we can keep peace alive with an alternative solution. This is one thing. The other one is that we have very big difficulties with reaching out to the public, because the media are dominated, all sorts of media, with the exemption of social media, they are dominated by mainstream politics. Whatever this politics is, but this is what is in the media, not the solutions which maybe are prepared by the civil society groups. Then, what could be the approach which would work in the early warning moment? It's a so-called issue coalition. When you have something which is important to the people and people are ready to fight for, and we know that the outcome will make stronger the peace side of the society, then you have to organize it. This issue coalition on this specific issue. And you have to use it to make this part of the solving of the solution in a peaceful way stronger. Another thing was interesting. We understood that the solidarity and coordination between civil society on the national level and international level, especially with regard to women, for example, works perfectly. This is not the problem. The problem is to have the ear of the responsible people in the international bodies and in the international big governments who can be very important to prevent the war and to stop the conflict to grow. This is, I think, the main things that we came up with.
Okay, great. So a lot of early action, actually, the modality for early action being an issue, a coalition of people who actually care about working on the particular risk and having a solution, right? It's not enough to say, we don't want this or that's not right. there has to be an alternative path, an alternative vision laid out to counter conflict risks. And that vision has to be grounded in reality. It has to be grounded in the real society. Okay, so do we have any desire to interact amongst the three groups? Or shall we ask Niels to make some concluding reflections that we will then take all of your work and present it to the plenary later in the afternoon? Any interaction amongst the groups?
I think that it was very similar in our group. We also saw that the freedom of media is a crucial thing. So I think that one of the very first early warnings in any situation is when the media are not free anymore in the society. This is the alarm. Because it means that the discussion is out and only one solution will be on the table, and every possibility to discuss it, to move it from the conflict to the solution of the conflict in a peaceful way will be much more difficult. And whatever can be done in order to prevent this situation should be done, and also with international support. For example, we know that in the situation of Yugoslavia, the media were totally under the control of Milosevic in Serbia. And the media were totally under the control of Tudjman in Croatia, and so on and so forth. It was not much better everywhere. So it was really important to have this UTEL channel, which was supported from outside, where the people who were for a peaceful solution were present with their proposals. But this came too late. It was not seen everywhere. It came in the moment when the emotional orientation toward the other as an enemy already became too spread to be able to use it as a tool for preventing the war.
Any thoughts on that from colleagues? I mean, free media is, of course, key, but you can't frame everything around that one pillar, because in many societies we have to deal with the world, as Helen Clark says, as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in many societies you already have quite a difficult space for media. So helping to open media can be one avenue, but we can't rely on media as the only early warning system, particularly where obviously we have a lot of media control. There is social media, though, and looking at social media as an alternative platform. I know you guys discussed that. No?
Well, I think from the point of view of, again, of the two ideal types of governance in a country, from a national government point of view, of course, social media can also be controlled and regulated. That depends very much on the amount of freedom and space you give it as a national government and as a constitution. So let's say we go again to the authoritarian side of it. Media would be fully controlled, and also social media would be either non-existent because they would be stopped or blocked, or would be as well rather circumscribed in their ability to do that. On the other ideal type side, on the libertarian, let's say, free government, democratic and inclusive, of course, also social media are part of the free media in that mindset of the legitimate ability of people to voice their concerns and ask for remedies of their grievances in that sense. Maybe I would just link back to the discussion in the UN group and the logic of stakeholder, broad stakeholder analysis and so on. Of course, again, if your public discourse in a country functions well, then you don't need that because all the stakeholders should be there. Of course, on the other side, the other extreme, if it doesn't function at all because you're an authoritarian government, you don't want that, then the UN has no chance moving in there. But in all the other shades in between, this is a possibility to come in and facilitate something, I'm sure, in not fully authoritarian regimes, but those who think they should have some outside involvement to reduce conflict or get an early warning of something which threatens maybe their own stability, which goes that far.
Yeah, I think Seneca, please, and also Seneca is a very good way of turning things around so it sounds like national governments should like them. So, and this seems to be one of those times in this conversation where you need to do the Seneca magic. Seneca, over to you.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking for a retirement plan. So, politics next, I guess. Sri Lanka. No. Just speaking now as a former journalist, and I was saying to Mark and Bob that my first job was as military intelligence. And in a civil war. I'm looking at lessons learned from back in 1985, from a civil war in Sri Lanka to now, with Brexit in the US. So all this is great, but there is a critical mass of people in all of these different environments who won't actually tell you how they feel, right? Not only because they're afraid of an authoritarian government, because they're afraid of what their neighbors will think of them. So whether it's a survey or some other way, an interview with the media, they will tell you what they think you want them to tell you. But then they will go and do something completely different. Because most often we are not rational creatures, right? And so then the question is, how do you actually dig below that surface? I mean, how do you actually identify that radicalized person? How do you actually figure out that this person is going to vote for Brexit or for Donald Trump or whatever, right? Because they won't tell you. All the polls and all the surveys and the media and the experts and the pundits will say, hey, this is how it's going to be. And the next thing you know, it's gone haywire, belly up. So if you're a national government, what the hell do you do in that situation?
I'm the last one who would advocate anything about Brexit, but I wouldn't go as far as to call them radicalized. I mean, this is still a legitimate. This is still within the legitimate, scheme of democratic governance, and I certainly was shocked, like many other people, about the Brexit vote, and I think it's wrong. And my comment yesterday was quite clear about that, I think. But it's within the legitimate discussion. You can say, hey, I want to have my sovereignty back. However, so for me, this is a point where you would say, yes, within the United Kingdom, you had people who had grievances. Whether they were misguided by an Australian media conglomerate, that's another question. But they thought they had grievances, and they voiced them within this vote, which was badly prepared, and so on and so forth. But it was legitimate, let's say. And in a free country, that's what you have to accept.
Yeah, please. The UN now has a counter of some nature or addition.
Not at all. I just think we were talking about, I think that one of the points that we came up with was also that we don't want to rely on just one indicator, because there can be many things that we would need to put together in order to get a good understanding of the situation in the country, whether we are moving towards conflict or not, or what kind of conflict and all of that. So free media is, of course, one. Whether the poll tells the right or wrong picture is another thing, but we have other things that we can look at as well to get a more complete picture. We shouldn't rely on just one aspect of the many things that we know are drivers of conflict.
Yeah, but I think it's valuable to realize there are some things that at this point are not easy to tap into if people are not willing to actually express them in ways where you can understand what the dynamics are within the society. It's very difficult to manage that, and you have to find an alternative route than the traditional routes to unearthing the dynamics. I'm going to let Niels, I think this has been, of course I would say this, but a really interesting conversation, and I think I'm going to let Niels do some, need not be conclusion and summing up, but some reflections. They love to say in New York, reflections. So I've been in New York at the headquarters a few times this year. There are lots of reflecting going on. But some reflections. And then, as I said, we'll take some conclusions from this into the plenary. Niels, over to you.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a high-risk strategy to come in at the end of a discussion where you've had very good group discussions and very good summaries and a very good, and try and sort of do more and better. So I'm not going to try to repeat it. And I don't have your very superior summing up capacities anyway, Shelley. So one thing, perhaps, which I'd like to maybe bring out, which wasn't perhaps mentioned so much, is that if we do want to get away from, a situation where we're addressing sort of quasi-conflict to conflict situations coming in at the last moment, coming in together with CNN or TRT, then we want to address more the early stages of a deterioration of the situation. We probably have to do a bit of work with our resourcing partners, who we used to call donors, because the resources need to follow, and they ain't at the moment. And this is something UNISDR and ISDR generally have been battling with for decades. That's point one. What I take away from the discussion is there's plenty of intelligence, and there's good intelligence. What we need to do, I think, is reflect a little bit on, another UN word, reflect a little bit on how we can objectify and simplify the way we process that intelligence, and to make sure, and I think this is really an important part, is that we benefit from all the sources, and the more community-based, the better, the more sources we have of information. And I'm always reminded of one of the great sort of indicators of conflict is human rights violations, increasing, slowly eroding human rights and increasing violations. And that kind of stuff we're going to get from communities and from people who work with communities rather than in UN offices, to be honest with you. So let's think systems. I mean, we're not talking algorithms here. We're talking bona fide human-driven systems. We're talking dialogue, and we're talking inclusion. And then finally, yeah, we come up with analysis. We come up with the best analysis in the world. How is the trigger going to work? What is actually going to, how are we going to go from the stage of saying to ourselves, whoa, this is going pretty badly, this could go completely pear-shaped, from that stage to actually intervening and trying to prevent it from going pear-shaped and preventing loss of life and kids growing up never having known anything other than conflict, which is the case in Syria. So there we are. That's the challenge, I guess.
Thanks, Niels. Thank you all for engaging in our corner. It wasn't really a side of the room, it was in the main room. But thank you guys, and I hope it was a useful discussion. This is really where we want to see, and where I think New York and the new Secretary General wants to push us much more to be in this, as Niels said, green to yellow space, and have some of the answers to these questions. So thank you all, and enjoy the lunch.